All right, folks, welcome to our Tuesday coffee with Alan Booker and Shawn Mills from Hack My Homestead. And Alan is certainly not drinking coffee this morning because he's not a coffee drinker. He's more into herbal teas. We talked about that yesterday. But this is your opportunity to get a question into Alan. If you watched his How Self Reliant is Your Kitchen session on the Learn from Legends webinar or at Self Reliance Festival, I think it was last spring that you did that. Yeah. It's the time to get it answered by Alan himself. So if you have questions, put the word question in all caps and we will go from there. But let's start. Alan, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Oh, yes. Well, I guess the beginning of it is going back to the fact that although I grew up in Florida on the coast between Eglin Air Force Base and Hurlburt Field, so I grew up in that kind of milieu. Every year we would go up and visit my grandparents and relatives in West Virginia. And my grandmother had a huge farm because she had to feed her 12 children during the Great Depression. And she was still farming in her up to when she passed at around 90. Had a huge farm, and so huge garden, and so I would get out and garden with her every morning. She, root cellar and all the things, right? And then one of my aunts would take me out wandering and show me the herbs and how to wild harvest medicine and make medicine. So those are some of my early memories. And ended up going to undergrad in electrical engineering, and then getting out from that and starting to work on what at the time was a newfangled thing called the internet, and helping to figure out how we were going to scale that up and make it global. And pretty soon started realizing that the way we were doing a lot of the engineering of all the technology and infrastructure for civilization was pretty destructive as well. It had a lot of side effects. And so I got into trying to figure out how we were going to do better. Like what would we be able to do to have a really high quality of life while at the same time not really destroying the ecosystem while we were at it. And that's been kind of one of my things for the past 25 years. These days I run the Institute of Integrated Regenerative Design. I train design professionals how to do that. And so I do courses where we have engineers and architects and urban planners and agroecology, and agronomy specialists and everything in, and we just train them how to do it. And so that's kind of what I'm up to these days. And I'm trying to help people figure out how we're going to not only do technology better, but keep ourselves healthy, happy, and sane in the process.
Something that's been happening in the Bitcoin and decentralized digital world is once people really jump into it and get to know it, they start, if they weren't already, they start realizing that the food system's broken, that their health is broken. We have a friend who just spent 17 hours waiting in the ER with her mom trying for a bed, for example. And they start getting back to the land in a lot of ways. So have you noticed that? And then at the same time, homesteaders who had a tendency to follow the conventional advice of the USDA, like extension office, are moving towards permaculture.
Yes. Yeah, we've seen a lot of that. The first thing I would say is that you have to understand that the extension offices are an extension of the chemical industry at this point in time. And I'm an engineer. I'm very practical at this, so I'm just going to be like, it's pretty straightforward. There's a quote we keep on coming back to, which is, "You show me the incentives, and I'll show you the outcome." And that comes from Charlie Munger, who is Warren Buffett's partner. And so when you put the economic incentives in place, guess what happens? People follow those economic incentives. And so what we're seeing is there's a lot of money to be made by creating a huge amount of cheap food and pumping it out there. And it just so happens that makes people very sick. And so so you can make money on the front end by shoveling, not quite food at people to eat. It's chemical gook is what it is. Then when they get sick, you can make them, you can make a lot of money on them. And there was an economist we were talking to not too far back, and what they said is There's nothing more profitable in the US economy than a chronically sick child. And so when you think about that for a second, it's like, well, where's the incentive? And the incentive economically is to create chronically sick children, or at the very least, not to do the things that would prevent it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had a similar, in company management, we'd say things like, what gets measured gets managed. And so it's similar to the outcome versus incentive, where if we're focusing on the wrong things, we're just going to get more of the wrong things.
So here's a question. If somebody is just coming into wanting to become more self-reliant, more regenerative in their own life, what are some places where they can start, like easy to start with, rather than, because when you start going down the rabbit trail, it starts seeming very overwhelming. So let's just say typical person in a house or duplex with a little yard, like what can they do? Going to work every day, driving their car to the thing, or jumping on the subway or whatever, however they get there.
I have an unusual answer to that.
I didn't expect anything else from you, Alan.
Step number one, get rid of your TV and your Netflix subscription and whatever other streaming, whatever. It's like these are things that basically rob your time, and it's like we're trying to think in stories. I mean, not trained. We're human beings. We think in stories. And so if you keep on having these stories bombarding your brain, then it just takes where your mind is going, and it takes it away from the ability to do any of that, because all the stories you're hearing there are the opposite of your goal at that moment. And it's also an infinite time sink. So if you want to get any of this done, one of the prerequisites to me is to get off of the programming. And there's the old joke about why they call it programming, is that it is programming. It programs your brain. Mm-hmm. And so to me, step number one as a prerequisite is just to, and also it also just triggers your chronic stress to have all this stuff thrown at you constantly. So get that out of your brain, and all of a sudden your brain clears up and you got time to actually start going in this direction. So that to me is like step one.
What's step two?
The step two is actually learning to make food from scratch for yourself.
And that seems like it's so easy or so straightforward, but it's a struggle for people who've never cooked.
Absolutely. I was teaching a group with a church, and I had a bunch of the students, they were high school students, helping make the food for dinner. And we had a young lady, I guess she was a senior in high school, and I asked her to cut up an onion. And she picked up the onion in her left hand and the chef's knife in her right hand, and started to saw the onion in half in her hand. And about the same time, there was a seventh grader young lady who had grown up cooking at her with her mom, and we both saw this at the same time. We both just hollered, "Stop!" Right? And the seventh grader is like, "Oh my God, don't you know anything? Come here!" And so she's like, next thing you know, we have the seventh grader teaching all these high schoolers like how to use a knife, what to do in the kitchen. They didn't have a clue. They didn't even know how to like safely pick up a knife without sending themselves to the emergency room. And so it's like, okay, great. We grow all our own food. We get food from local supply. If we don't know what to do with it, we can't go anywhere, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like even if you're buying the raw ingredients from a grocery store in the beginning, at least if you're making your own food, now you know what to do with real food once you learn how to source it or grow it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, something I tell people who are getting started in homesteading is, as you're planning your garden and what to plant, there's going to be all this advice about what to plant when from other homesteaders in the area. And if you don't like the thing that they are telling you to grow because it's so easy, like radishes or those low barrier to entry, something you can grow, you have like almost instant gratification because they're ready so quickly. But if you don't like radishes, what you end up with is a field of radishes that you have successfully grown that you don't like to eat. Now, I can't have too many radishes because I use them instead of potatoes and stew and all sorts of other stuff. I
Yeah.
like radishes, but if you don't like radishes or tomatoes or peppers or whatever you're growing food wise, or peaches for that matter, if you're putting peach like trees and stuff that you're putting in your yard, don't grow them. Don't put them in your plan. There are so many people that'll tell you what to do, but you've got to tailor everything to your life.
Yeah. On the other hand, if radishes absolutely like are something that grow on your site and you can't stop them, then in permaculture we put it this way. Well, okay, just take those radishes and put them through pigs and turn them into bacon, right?
Yep.
So part of the whole thing and thinking your way through it is like, what wants to grow on my site? Because there's stuff that people will tell you, you need to grow this. And like, well, my microclimate, the soil I happen to have on my site, it's a fight to grow that. So you're also going to look at what can I grow that's going to grow. And then there's the fact that sometimes that could be something that feeds you directly. And sometimes that can be fodder for other things, for chickens or for rabbits or for pigs and so forth, right?
Worms even.
Worms, yeah, exactly. You can eat worms and generate fertility and so forth.
One of the things that got me to discover and understand and see how permaculture and wild edible plants and all of that worked was the first raised bed I ever built. I bought a kit, a square foot gardening kit. So it was not nearly deep enough for my area. And it was like 6 inches. And I put weed cloth down. I built this bed. I had the little square grid on it. And I did all of the plant communities. And for 2 years, there was this weed that kept coming up through the bed. And every week, it was very persistent. And if I ignored it, it got as tall as me very quickly. And then I discovered elderberry. And I started trying to cultivate elderberry somewhere else. And I became aware that the weed in this raised bed, I had put the bed on top of an elderberry somehow. And to this day, that's one of the best places on my property to grow elderberry. And I remember I had been fighting it for 2 years. I discovered what it was. And I remember having this thought I know, how about that's where the elderberry grows? And then I started looking around my property and I realized different things grew different places, started doing more research, and eventually stumbled across Jack Spirko, who talked about permaculture. And I was like, oh, I'm already starting to do that by letting the stinging nettle be where the stinging nettle is and the elderberry be where the elderberry is and the poke grow where the poke grows.
So one of the things I figured out, because, in permaculture, Mollison and Holmgren, they both say that it all starts with observation. And as I've taught people, I've kind of figured out there was an assumption in that statement that's no longer true. And the assumption is that people are able to observe, because observing requires two things. One is it requires the ability to see the patterns that you're trying to look at. And the second thing is to put it into any use requires a certain amount of ecological knowledge of place. So, you have people who are fighting against the weeds and its, slam squirter, which is, incredible. It's probably more nutritious than nutrient dense than anything they're going to grow in their garden.
Mm-hmm.
But it's other things like, knowing what is and isn't going to. I have noticed one of the things is even when I take design professionals out on the landscape and we start walking around, that in a lot of cases, what's happening is they're walking right along beside me. They are not seeing what I'm seeing. Right? They don't have the ecological knowledge and they don't have the pattern recognition. They're literally looking at a thing. Like when we're teaching people plant ID, we have this phenomena we call the wall of green, right? They walk out and all they see is this wall of green. Their brain cannot even pull out the patterns of an opposite leaf plant versus an alternate leaf plant and simple versus compound leaf. They have never learned to see that. And so it all looks like this just uniform wall of green. And so there's pattern recognition that allows you to start seeing the different plants as individual plants. And then there's ecological knowledge. You kind of have to have those as a little bit of prerequisite to being able to effectively observe, to be able to do anything, right?
Right.
So that's one of the things I've noticed. So now I'm like having to spend a lot of time helping people with those prerequisites.
I'm sorry, I hit a button. I was trying to get questions from our Noster audience, which is on a different screen, and I didn't realize I had like focused in on me while you were talking. So apologies for that. Yeah, that's 100% true. So Strong Roots Resources is right here, and he's watching this live stream because I'm sure he's super stoked. You met Carrie Brown at Self Reliance Festival last time, and you two were like two peas in a pod. I watch him put wild edible walk after wild edible walk class out. I've not asked him this question, but people are always interested in that. And one of the ways to start learning what's around you is to take these classes. He's doing 2 of them at Self Reliance Festival that I know of. He's welcome to do as many as he wants. He has 2 on the schedule. But that's how you start recognizing what's around you. And I suspect he does these classes, and sometimes the same people come multiple times, because every time you walk into the woods with somebody who knows something about plants, you're like, oh, they even said that last time, and it just did not sink in. Even if I was taking pictures and notes and trying most earnestly to learn, there's only so much that like penetrates the noggin.
Yeah, I do a short course called Learning to See Plants. And the name of that's very intentional. And the reason is that people just try to go out and like, you point at a plant and you say, this is that. Then you go to another plant and you say, well, this is that. And then their brain can't absorb it because they don't have the pattern recognition. They don't. And so I literally don't start there. I start with, how do you tell the difference between a simple leaf and a compound leaf? Let's look at that. So when you look at a plant, you can just say, I don't care what the plant is. Just tell me, is it a simple leaf or a compound leaf? Okay, now that you know that, is this opposite or alternate? And then okay, let's look at the leaf structure. And I teach about 10 different patterns that you need to learn how to see. And then like take those 10 patterns and write those 10 questions down. And all of a sudden now, when you look at a plant, you start learning to ask yourself those 10 questions. And then you're going to realize that all of a sudden now you can go to the ID book or whatever, and the ID pops out at you, right? That's what you have to do. So that's why I'm saying we got to learn sort of this pattern literacy. And once you have that, now when you go out with somebody, if you learn those like 8 to 10 questions, you go with somebody who really knows plants. And as soon as they point something out, you're looking at it and going, oh, I see the patterns now. The patterns pop out at me. And then it can hit and it can stick in your brain. Because otherwise, yeah, you look at it and you walk away, and 2 days later, you're like, what was that? What did that? I don't remember what that looked like.
Right. You're making an actual connection where you're taking what you're seeing and you're adding enough context in your brain so that when you see that again, you're like, oh, A plus B equals C. Got it.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so at Self Reliance Festival, you're going to talk about building wealth locally by taking control of your food sovereignty, I think your genetics of your seeds and livestock. Can you tell us like Cliff Notes? What does that mean? It's going to be a really good session.
Yeah. Well, I know, Nicole, we were talking back and forth. So I want to talk about genetic capital, and you're like, oh, I don't even know how to explain that in a sentence to get everybody interested. And so I'll just give you this idea, which is kind of like you walk onto a piece of land and you're going to try to like have some food security, or your community is going to try to have some food security. It's like, if you don't have the right genetics, you cannot get out of the starting block. So what I mean by that is the genetics of your tree crops, genetics of your annual seed crops, and the genetics of your livestock. Okay. And what we keep on seeing is if you bring the wrong genetics in, well, 2 things. One is you got to buy the genetics and they're shipping them to you from California. Okay. And then number 2 is they arrive and they're the wrong genetics for your location and they don't work and you go struggle and it's a constant fight. So this is one of the big things we see is like, if you get the right genetics, you're almost halfway there, because it's like, what you're working with is adapted to place. It wants to thrive in place. It's much less likely to, like here in the southeastern United States, where I think we all are, all 3 of us on the call, it's like, yep, we're in fairly warm and humid, and therefore parasites are a thing, right? and you bring in genetics from a place that doesn't have that, and you're like, why am I fighting to keep my animals alive? Why am I fighting that this, I cannot grow a squash that doesn't just get taken by leaf fungi, things like that. And you're like, well, you don't have the right genetics. And so what we're going to look at is the fact that if we really want to have food security going forward, we as in a community level need to start thinking about how we steward the genetics we've got. Both our plants, our tree, our annual crops, our trees, and our animals.
Yeah, Margot says, you guys think you are warm and humid. That's cute. She's from Florida.
Yeah, I grew up there. So relatively warm and humid. I'm in
Definitely
northern
warmer and
Alabama.
more
So
humid than the places where the burpee seedlings are created,
right,
and where those genetics come from.
Absolutely.
You're gonna potentially get some hybrid vigor for 1 year with that, and then you're done, and now you're stuck to going back to the store and buying the seedling next year, and that cycle repeating.
That's right.
So I can't trace these seeds back 140 years scientifically, but through local lore, I have a tomato that's been saved in this area for about 140 years. And the way I got it was at the farmer's market. I used to sell my coffee at the farmer's market. And there was a guy named Timmy who had tomatoes, and I didn't have a great year. So I bought boxes of tomatoes. He's like, just come to my house. And just fields of these tomatoes. And it was in a year when tomatoes failed and they were robust. And I was like, oh, these tomatoes are delicious. Like, tell me about what variety it is. He's like, well, I got it from a farmer down the road. And he got it, he told me that they've been leaving it in that area for 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started growing them, and they do the best. So we just collect all the seeds from multiple ones and put them out every year. So instantly I went home and took one of the tomatoes and saved the seeds. And unbeknownst to me, other local friends were doing the same thing with those when they heard the story. And they don't have a name. They're an Oxheart style tomato, pink. And we started saving him, and he died 2 years later. And then his wife died 6 months after him. And that would have been just gone, except for like the next year after he died. I was talking to my friend, her tomato seedlings had failed. I'm like, well, I have some. I have this, and I have what I had now referred to as the 140-year Timmy tomato.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, you have Timmy Adcock's tomatoes? I was like, yeah, I started saving them a couple years ago when I heard about them and used them. And so I gave them back to her, and now we both grow them. And every time a new tomato person comes up in the county, I gift them a tomato. I'm like, this is the background of this tomato. If you start growing it, then we have more stability here, so that if somebody has a bad year, we still have that tomato. If you want one, I'll bring you one. I'll bring you seeds, actually.
That'd be cool. I would just say this. What you just pointed out, the story you just pointed out, goes to one of the things I always say about genetic capital. And there is some capital is abundance-based and some is scarcity-based. Money is scarcity-based. The value of money, the more money there is, the more it dilutes the value of it, right? However, genetic capital is abundance-based. Like, Nicole, what you just said is you're making yourself richer by giving it away, because the tomatoes produce more seeds than you could ever use. And by giving it away to people in your community, if you have a problem, you lose the seeds or whatever, they're going to turn right around and give it back to you. The entire community becomes more abundant the more everybody shares these kinds of things. And so you have to get out of the scarcity. Imagine if in our communities, what we were doing was every crop was like that, right? And that nobody was going back to the seed companies, out of Oregon and Washington State and having things sent over, but instead there was this seed exchange, and we were growing our own livestock, and it were locally adapted, poultry and pig, and of course down here it's the guinea hog, right? Is one of the very down in the area where I am, highly adapted to this area, and same thing for trees, for tree crops, fruits and nuts and so forth. And then we just give it away, and we get richer and richer as our community, as that becomes just part of what's available in our community.
Well, you'll be pleased to hear that we have the option for you to show slides at your presentation.
Oh, good.
They will not be very visible from the back of the room, but people who
Mhm.
need to come up and see them can. You'll need them in PDF format, I'm sure. But yeah, Alan set up this whole online quiz thing to help people stay tuned to his presentation, because I was like, there's no slides. And then I think 2 days before SRF, we had a small TV in front. I bought a 55-inch outdoor TV, so it will be hopefully bright enough under that tent. And Kiri's husband, Glenn, is building a stand for it that's super solid, because I was not finding, even on the commercial side for events, I wasn't finding a good option for a stand that wasn't like ridiculous price point. So he's just making something out of wood that can't blow over.
Yep.
So.
Good. That's all. I mean, to me, I've been doing presentations like this kind of thing for so long, and it's like just being able to show people pictures of what we're talking about is super helpful. So yeah, that's great. We'll take advantage of that.
Yeah, my tomato has a second chapter, because I also saved this really big tomato that I got at the market from an Amish seller that I referred to as the big assed tomato.
Mm-hmm.
And those seeds, I gave them to a friend. They got a 5-pound tomato out of them.
Wow.
But they crossed with the Timmy. I have one plant out there that's a big ass Timmy tomato, and it changed the color and got bigger. And I was like, well, I'm going to save those seeds too. So,
yep. I did a presentation as a bonus for Paul Wheaton for one of his Kickstarters called Epigenetics and Seed Saving. And I think the subtitle was like breeding locally adapted plants. And they put that up. I think it's available for like $10 on the Permi site. But it's like 90 minutes of me going through and explaining a lot about epigenetics, which sounds fancy, but what it basically is it's really fascinating information about how plants work. And I kind of end up explaining why it is that this idea of like, yeah, we have the doomsday seed vault, and you just take your seeds and you go put them in there. That's what I call static seed saving. It's like, yes, we should do that as an emergency backup. The whole thing is life doesn't work that way. Every year you grow out your plants in your local environment. The plants literally learn the emerging conditions, the emerging problems. They figure their way out on how to survive around it. So they start to adapt to pests and diseases and changes in local climate and things like that. And so static seed saving should only be like our emergency backup. The way to save seed is what I call dynamic seed saving. And the same thing is true of livestock. They need to adapt as well. So putting sperm and egg in a cryobank or whatever, that's like the emergency, open only in case of the emergency, break glass
like
in case
we really screwed up.
Yeah, we really screwed up, and that's our emergency break glass in case of emergency backup.
Yeah, cool. Okay, I got a question here that's on a new topic now for something completely different. Do you all have any tips for getting rid of kudzu on a property? Goats sprays. Is the problem the solution?
Yeah, I think so. Shawn, I'll let you go take a whack at that one if you've got anything, and then I'll.
Yeah, so growing up in Georgia, I've got a lot of experience with kudzu. We actually had a little kudzu plot at our house that I was in charge of preventing from going past the boundaries where it was allowed to grow. So one of the things is you got to, are we talking about kudzu or like 100 acres of kudzu, right? Are we talking about kudzu that's still mainly on the ground, or are we talking about kudzu that's already taken over trees? And the reason why that's important, particularly with the trees, is that what'll happen is, your deciduous trees are going to drop their leaves in the winter, and that allows wind to blow past those trees when you get like your early.
Of course, this is when his Starlink goes wonky on us.
Oh, did I
yeah, you were to the wind blows through the trees, and then the government didn't want you to talk to us, or
maybe
whatever.
The wind's blowing through my Starlink signal. So But yeah, so that's a big problem. And so if you've got it on trees, you want to cut all of those vines at the base, and you want to start pulling those vines out of the trees, because you'll end up with trees on the ground that wouldn't otherwise be on the ground. Now, how do you deal with the actual kudzu on the ground? In my experience, the easiest or the most effective way is mechanical removal, right? And now goats, I would consider goats to be mechanical removal. They're going through and chopping. And so if you've got a plot that's had kudzu for a long time, you might have boulder size roots, which is just stored energy in the ground. And so you're either going to have to continually cut that back, or let goats eat it, let it grow back and deplete some of that stored reserves, and then do it again and over and over and over again, until that reserve is depleted. And we're talking about, if you've had 10 years of that stuff growing, it's probably got at least 10 years of reserve built up in there. But it grows so fast that if you can do this, if you can just stay on top of it, let that very quick juvenile growth happen, because what it wants to do is it wants to get those leaves out, start collecting more solar energy, and then storing it back. Okay. So basically you're letting the first part of that process happen, and then you are mechanically removing it so that it's got to go back to the reserve. Okay. Now you can burn. That's another thing. I've seen people, once they've kind of got it really knocked down and they can see where the primary colonies are coming up, you can go in and start using a weed burner to burn some of that. But outside of cutting it all back, digging everything up, and even then, even if you did dig everything up, it's like Jerusalem artichokes. Like, you're still going to have roots there that are trying to come back to life. And so, again, if this is a problem that's taken a long time to get started, just be aware of the fact that it's going to take a long time to deal with. Now, I've heard of people using, going the Roundup chemical warfare method. But even then, it's going to do the same thing. You're still going to have, and I don't know if there's any organic type of herbicides that would work here. But like I said, in my experience, mechanical removal is the best way, whether you're mowing it, bush hogging it, running goats through there. But it's like Alan mentioned before. Well, if you don't like radishes, but you can grow a lot of radishes, you can pull those radishes and feed them and make bacon out of them. And so there are a lot of places in kudzu country where people have herds of goats that they will bring to your property and run through your property on a rotation. Or you could buy some of your own goats and start doing it. So the reason why everyone kind of goes to goats is because goats will eat the crap out of it. Mm-hmm. And they like it. It's not a problem for them. So, yeah, like I said, mechanical and staying on top of it until you've depleted those below ground reserves.
All right. You have some clarification. It's in Alabama, maybe a few trees, but mostly on the ground.
What about you, Alan? What have you seen done?
Yeah, I think, Shawn, that was a fan. I mean, what you were talking about with the energy reserve and the roots is exactly where I go as well. So, I mean, I think that's a perfect answer. So the big thing is, if you're going to do this, you're going to have to make certain that you don't let it get up and get those leaves out for a long period of time, because they're going to then start, as you said, pumping energy back in there. So you can't be like, oh, I'm just gonna let it go for a while. I'm tired of dealing with it. Because as soon as you do, it gets those leaves out and it starts just pumping energy right back into the roots, and you're back to you get back to square zero pretty quick. So you got to stay on top of it, and I think that's it. And yeah, I'm afraid what's happening is we're breeding a lot of herbicide-resistant plants. There's this interesting thing that's going on now. I covered this in the epigenetics course called horizontal gene transfer. Which is that bacteria have figured out how to persist in the face of glyphosate, for example. And now they're teaching the trick to plants. That's why we're getting these super weeds. They're taking the genetic strategy and they're handing it over to the plants. And for a while, botanists and biologists were saying, well, that can't possibly happen. But then all of it, they figured, yep, it is. Life is smart that way. The bacteria were like, hey, we got this thing figured out. Here's our trick. And the next thing you know, you got all these what they call super weeds. It's like you can
Mhm.
spray glyphosate and everything else over. And they're like, yeah, we don't care. So I'm be curious to see how long it is before we get a kudzu that like just laughs at glyphosate. It's
Yeah.
probably going to happen at some point.
They're never going to laugh at getting chewed up, though.
Correct. Exactly right.
Or stomped on if you're a redneck. I don't know if this means we have some kudzu in the pasture, but it might mean he has seen some kudzu in the pasture. I do not. I didn't think we had any over here, but I had a property once with a good 2 acres of kudzu starting to take over. And I will admit I bulldozed it the first round with the intention of bringing goats up there and then sold the property. So now it's their problem.
Yeah.
I'm a kind person.
Yeah, like I said, I think the mechanical method is the best way. And I would imagine once you start making a dent, you can probably go in and plant, other things in there, so whether that's like purple cow peas or other vining things, it's not really gonna outcompete, but you want to plant stuff in there where when it gets either mowed down mechanically or mowed down by an animal, it leaves behind something that's good. So that's why I went to the pea, because now you've got nitrogen that you're putting back into the soil. But that it wouldn't hurt to do that. I haven't read anything where people have done that and have actually outcompeted it. But you can think about it from the standpoint of you're kind of like prepping the soil for the next thing that you're going to put in if you're doing stuff like that.
That's a whole nother chapter.
Yeah.
Well, hey, Alan, I got a question for you. I have lived on my homestead 17 years. The entire time, my kitchen garden has been in zone 2. Because when I moved here, the garden was in zone 2. And it did not occur to me till this year that maybe, I don't know, I could put that in zone 1. And so I'm moving to raised beds for that, because as I get older, I feel like getting down on the ground is not going to be as easy. And I do like my my plants that I grow. But now I'm faced with these beds that need to be filled with stuff. So what would you do at this time of year to get a series of 4 or 5 raised beds? Nothing huge, like going with, because I have lots of soil I can get and dump in there, but I don't think that's the right answer.
Right. It's kind of like, well, what do what you're always thinking about in design, like how do we connect flows, right? And so when you're thinking about fall crops, you're kind of like, well, you got two outflows from your garden products. One is towards the kitchen, but the other is towards other systems, and that could be animal fodder. So immediately on thinking about that, you're like, even if you are trying to, like if you're feeding a stored fodder to animals, having fresh material really helps with the animals over winter, like into the fall. So it's like, And then, so I'll be looking at that and going, well, obviously you're looking towards what could be a storage like a root crop that could go in, that could store and help get you over the hunger gap. That's a term we use in the temperate zones, which is like that time in late winter where your food stores are starting to go down and you're not quite to the point where the spring crops are coming in. And so storage crops are there. So I love things like winter squash that can just spread out, cover ground, keep the weeds down themselves, and produce these big, hardy, storage, very low, very low work to get them ready to store. Just harden them off a little bit, and they can just sit on a shelf for months, right? And the cool thing about those is they got a lot of carbs, they got a lot of good energy, but they're a lower glycemic, so they're good for you as a winter storage food. But if you get into trouble, you can feed them to chickens, you can feed them to hogs, and that sort of stuff. So that's, once those plants get established, they kind of like go out and just take care of themselves, very low maintenance. So I would think in that direction.
What would you do? He froze again. You know how that happened? It's like he looks very serious, though. Yeah. What would you do to get the soil kick started? Because I can dig it from my garden, but it's, it's not as awesome. Just put it that way, to just move it.
Yep. So all I'll say is to kickstart any soil, the first thing we're looking at is trying to get the soil organic matter moving and trying to get the right biology in the soil. Because everything I grow, we're going to grow with what I call ecological cultivation, not chemical cultivation. I'm not putting any chemical fertilizers on. I'm not putting any herbicides or pesticides or fungicides on and so forth. What I'm doing is I'm getting the right biology going. I don't have to do any of the rest of that. So oftentimes what we'll do is we'll make certain that if we need some mechanical aeration, if it's just dirt instead of soil, make certain we mechanically aerate. We'll get some living roots in there with and then we'll get the right biology on it, which means we're putting compost or a compost tea on there to get the right biology in place. And what we're really trying to do is get the soil organic matter over 2.5%, because if you can do that, now all of a sudden you get this virtuous cycle. The first 2.5% of soil organic matter is the big climb up the hill. And when you get to 2.5, it's like, oh, it just got easier. And now the soil food web really starts to take off. The plants really start to be able to do their thing. And then they feed the soil food web. The soil just starts to accelerate. So if you've got certain kinds of problems, heavy clay, sand, biochar amendment can be helpful as well, just depending upon the soils you've got. Or if you just got dirt, sometimes biochar amendment, compost, aerated compost tea, cover crop with living roots in the soil. There you go. Some of the fastest way to jumpstart, and if necessary, mulching. Fastest way to jumpstart dirt towards soil.
What about IMO?
So so an aerated compost tea is, and for people who might not know that one, it's indigenous microorganisms. In other words, you've got, some of your best source for this, the good biology, is to go out and find ecosystems around you that it's the healthiest you possibly can find in about the same stage of succession that you want to grow. And then get some of that soil or harvest. There's some different ways of harvesting those microorganisms. One of them is just as simple as grabbing some dirt from that place, bringing it back and sprinkling it into your compost pile while you're making compost. And you're getting those indigenous microorganisms that happen to be thriving in a really healthy example of your environment. And hey, this is another place where genetic capital, those microorganisms have heard of them, genetic capital. So if you realize that Nicole's been working on her garden for 17 years and the microbiology there is amazing, you say, hey, Nicole, can I have a handful of soil? And that's an inoculation. It's kind of like getting the sourdough starter from the person who's been doing sourdough, right? It's like you're getting the good microorganisms to make a great sourdough. It's the same thing. You're getting the inoculation to bring in that are indigenous microorganisms that you can throw into your compost. And then that starts to get your compost with really great indigenous microorganisms that when they are applied to your garden are going to thrive in your climate.
This opens a whole new chapter on homestead exchanges, but you're not going to put that soil in a baggie for 6 months to a year and have it work. That's like literally you take it and you go use it right away and it feeds on something. Otherwise, it's going to die.
And just be really careful that you only do that from somebody whose garden is thriving, because you don't want to import diseases and so forth. There's this idea called competitive exclusion. And this is the way I tend to go about making certain I don't get nasty. People are like, well, you're not using fungicides and all that kind of stuff. How do you not get all these diseases? And the answer is that good biology will keep out bad biology. And if you it's the difference between if you're trying to be invaded, it's the difference between just bombing everything, like we're going to kill everything, because these poisons don't know the difference. If you're putting like a fungicide on, it doesn't know the difference between the good guys and the bad. It just kills everything, and now you got a problem, because what you've done is you've just created a open field that the bad stuff can just come back in and like take over really quickly. What you want is you want to cultivate the good guys. And once they're there and really help, they will stake down their territory and they will do their own warfare to keep the bad guys out. That's the winning strategy, because you're letting the good guy microbes, who are the experts at this, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've got a long history of being able to do this. You're letting them fight the battle for you. You don't know how to fight that battle. Your only way of doing it is just broad spectrum, blow everything up and make the situation worse. That's always been my thing. If you have somebody whose garden's thriving, they haven't had, fungal disease problems and that sort of stuff, and they don't have disease problems or whatever, you bring in a little bit of good microorganisms, and then that starts to get going in your area. You develop competitive exclusion, and next thing you know, your disease problem starts to go way down.
Right. Yeah. So bringing soil down from where you have been working behind the house to the new area would be a good idea for sure.
Yes.
As long as there's no nasty diseases up there. I actually finally got rid of tomato blight up there. And tomato blight's just not a thing on my property right now.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was.
Yeah. There's people who are like, oh, well, you got tomato blight, you can't grow there anymore. It's like, no. What's happening is if you get competitive exclusion going well enough, a lot of these rules just go away.
Right.
Because a lot of the things that you've been told about growing have been by people who are doing chemical cultivation and whose plants are really, really unhealthy. And they're strategies to try to keep extremely unhealthy plants from dying. That's what they are.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You wouldn't treat good, healthy plants in a healthy environment with healthy soil with the same strategies that you would, like you say, when you've got a monocrop that on a plot that gets sprayed 5 times a year.
Yeah. Tactical made some amazing compost last spring. And when I started my seedlings, I made sure that compost was involved so that they would be like, this is what and then I made sure that compost was used where they were planted. And I think that's part of what made a big difference on the tomatoes in particular this year.
Mm-hmm. So here's a community idea for you. Doing really good composts is a skill. So, get 1 or 2 people in your community who really study it, know how to do that. And then the community can buy an aerated compost tea brewer as a community resource. And now what happens is every couple of weeks, you take some of that really great compost as a feedstock, you make an aerated compost tea, a couple 100 gallons of it. And then it's like, okay, everybody come get a few gallons. And now you go and you apply that to your garden. And what's happening is you're getting all this really great biology that's right for your area. And of course, when they're doing this, they should be checking it with a microscope to make certain that the biology really went great. It's not that hard to do. I know it sounds, if you're not used to it, it sounds like, oh my God, he's wanting me to microscope. I've taught middle schoolers to do this, okay? And they love it. It's fun with like a $300 microscope. So, and you can look at it and go, yep, that's great biology. It's fantastic. Send it out to everybody in the community and they start applying it. And this way, not everybody has got to go off and think, oh, I got to get an aerated compost tea brewer. I got to learn how to do I got to know how to do Johnson Sioux compost and thermophilic compost. And these are things. Why are we all feeling like we have to do this by ourselves? That's like what we were programmed with as part of consumer culture. Instead of thinking about this as a community food security enterprise where we all support each other and we share like this, and we all become more wealthy because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, self-reliance doesn't work by yourself.
Right.
How would you go about applying that? Because I've heard there are certain, foggers and things like that you don't want to use. So what would be the best way to actually apply that once it's made?
Yeah. So the thing you got to remember is this, that you're now not just you're not applying chemicals, you're applying life. And so the challenge is we'll use, like for a garden, we'll just use a little backpack sprayer. But what you have to do is basically make certain that the orifice in the sprayer is big enough and you take the filter out. And the reason is we don't want to take and fine mist, because what happens is, remember, through this sprayer coming out of your pack, through the hose and out the sprayer, you got life. You got bacteria, you got fungi, you got protozoans and beneficial nematodes, not the bad ones, the beneficial nematodes. And you're trying to get them on there. And you're trying to get them both on the soil, and you're trying to get them on the leaf surfaces, because believe it or not, that's really important for disease resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're doing is you get this backpack, you take out the filter, you make certain the orifice is not small so that you're getting big drops out, right? And then you just pump it up and you go out and you spray. If you don't have that, heavens, just pour it,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you don't have that, you can take a little cup and just pour it, and just take it and sprinkle it. If you don't have, if you don't have the high-tech part, don't worry about it. All we're trying to do is get these microorganisms established, and then they will spread themselves.
Yeah, one of those sprinkly water things too.
Absolutely. One of the just little watering cans will do it. Absolutely.
Get one you can unclog when the little
right.
Or if it's plastic, I guess you can. I have a metal one, but and the holes are bigger on that. The plastic ones have tiny holes, so you can make them bigger.
The only thing I would say is, if you're doing this, remember you're doing biology, so clean everything every time after you use it, because you don't want bad stuff to kind of just start like getting in the pores of the plastic and everything. So the big thing is, your brewer and whatever you're using to spray or distribute, wash it carefully after use so that you keep it clean. Mm-hmm. And you don't get into the problem of bad stuff setting up housekeeping in there.
Makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. It's funny, we didn't talk about herbs that make you sleep today. We were all about that. You must have been tired when you were talking to me. You were thinking about a nap.
Yeah, I just flew back from New Hampshire. I had to get up, what was 2:45 in the morning Central Time to make it back home. So when we talked yesterday, I had to get up at like 2:45 in the morning and then go jump on a plane at Boston Logan Airport and do all the things to get here. And so yeah, we were talking about that whole thing. It's like, I try very hard not to have to use strong stimulants or sedatives. So the body has the ability to maintain homeostasis and be able to go up and down. And the more you depend upon a stimulant to get you up or a sedative to bring you down, the more that your body's ability to self-regulate, it just gets lazy. It's like that ability atrophies. And the window of where you can self-regulate gets narrower and narrower, to the point where I've seen people get addicted to both, right? It's like, oh, I need to be up, so now I'm going to stimulate, right? Okay, well, now I'm up, I'm wired, and like now I can't come back down on my own, so now I got to have a sedative, right? So we were talking about things like skullcap and valerian and so forth, and I was saying, for me, I like to use something gentle when I have to. Usually I want to keep myself self-regulated. So I'll do something like Tulsi, which is holy basil or Tulsi, which is a very gentle nervine. It just helps the nerves relax. It helps de-escalate just a little bit. Or some people really like a mixture of Tulsi and ashwagandha. Just helps them de-escalate. And then you take something like, passion flower or valerian or skullcap or whatever, and you only use those in more more extreme cases where it's like something's going on and I've just really got to come down. So it's like, and the same thing, I don't drink caffeine. Here's my drink of choice during the day. It's just straight water out of glass, no plastic, thank you. Because we've looked in the microscope and we understand when you put water in plastic, exactly how many little tiny microplastics and nanoplastics get into the water, and then they're in your body. So I drink out of glass, not out of plastic.
I've not bought a microscope yet, but I've been coming back to wanting a microscope over and over this year, so it's probably in my future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, $300, $400 can get you a microscope that will do what you need just to figure out what's going on. I mean, if you really
what kind of magnification would you be looking for, Alan?
Okay, so you're looking for being able to do this is important. If you are wanting a microscope as a community resource, you want to be able to do a couple things with it. One is to be able to look at the soil. The other that's really interesting is you can do, I know if you haven't heard this before, it sounds gross, fecal microscopy.
Yep.
And this is to look at the parasite load in the fecal material of your livestock. So you can just start to get an early warning, right, that how much parasite we're getting. So there's little kits where you can take and sample the fecal material, prepare it, put it on a slide, look at it, and there's some great resources out there so you can look at it and go, oh, my sheep or my goats or my cattle, this is what we're looking at. These are the kinds of parasites we're seeing. Here's the parasite load, right? In addition to being able to look at eye color, which is a whole different thing, right? That's something, if you don't know about that, go look that one up, because that's an early warning for that. So that's one thing, okay? The other thing is that looking at the good versus the bad microorganisms in your soil. What you're going to want is a 10x eyepiece, and you're going to want a 40x objective would be your high end, your high magnification. So you can get a total of 400x magnification. And we do a lot of work at 400x magnification for both these reasons. And then you can get a 20x, a 10x, and a 4x. And now you've got a wide range of things you can look at. So objectives. So the eyepieces are the things up here that you look at, 10x eyepieces, and then the objectives are the little magnifying pieces that look right down directly, and you can rotate them so you can switch them out. 40x, 20x, 10x, 4x. Usually the microscopes will handle 4, and you're set. And if there's anybody who really is looking at wanting to do like high-end microscopy for like an entire area, then there's other stuff we can get into. Somebody said something about a digital microscope. Here's the thing. You can buy what's called a trinocular microscope for almost the same as you can a normal binocular. Again, binocular, it's got two things you look at, and you just look down and you can see what you got. Trinocular has a third mount point so a camera can go on top. Okay, now when you do that, you put the camera on top. Now you can take and put like a 4K high def camera on your microscope, and you can display what you're seeing on a big TV screen. And anybody who's doing this for a long period of time will tell you, you don't want to stare through the microscope for hours and just blast your eyes. And so most people who are doing this for a long time, they'll put the camera on there. A digital microscope that doesn't have the eyepieces, I would never do, and I'll tell you why. Okay, when it fails, you're done. Your microscope is useless. You know, I have worked with optical microscopes that are 120 years old. As long as you can put some light in there some way, they still work. They're always going to work. They don't need electricity. They don't need any of that kind of stuff. They're going to work for another 100 years if you keep them clean, right? A digital microscope, as soon as something digitally in there goes wrong, it's useless.
Right.
So what I would do is I would if you want that, get a trinocular. So you will always be able to just look right through the optical path no matter what happens. And if you want the camera, you can put the camera up there and you can do that. You got the best of both worlds.
Well, that was super helpful, because I'm going to be in the market for a microscope at some point. And it looks like Carrie is like, well, now I need a scope. And it's not so much the soil biology as the sheep poop.
Yep.
Because I do that, the check for the anemia,
yes.
But I want to have a better picture of what's going on. I found a guy in like 2 miles or 3 miles from me. He's probably 10 miles from me, who raises the same variety of sheep that I do. And he's been doing it for 10 or 20 years here without any interventions. He's like built their genetics up. So I'm hoping he will give me a ram in exchange for money to impregnate my sheep this year, because all of my rams are basically related to the ewes at this point, and I need to bring something else in.
Yeah, there's been huge problems with barber pole worm down here in Alabama. I'm sure it kind of goes up into that area. One of the things that talking to the folks that were doing all the experiments up at Tuskegee University, they were like, one of the biggest things about barber pole worms is they tend to be down towards the base of the grasses. And so if you are having your ruminants overgraze an area, the likelihood of them picking up a large load is much higher. So rotationally grazing, moving them around rotationally and making certain they do not overgraze is a huge strategy in keeping parasites low in the Southeast. Because as soon as you let them get in there and they keep on eating and eating and down until they get down towards the bottom, now, boy, you'll see parasite loads explode. And then keeping them off of top of their own fecal matter is the same, So you get them off and you don't come back for a while. Especially if you can get 60 days, you're golden. Like if you can rotate them and not bring them back for 60 days, you're kind of breaking a lot of parasite cycles. So these are like low tech, no tech strategies for dealing with parasites naturally. No chemicals, no drugs, whatever.
Yeah, that's luckily we've been able to do that. When I first had, so the sheep came from Ohio with strong genetics, but moving them to Tennessee was hard on them because the microbiome's different in their gut. But they acclimated. So the first year we had to deal with some things. None of them were parasite load though. But I had a local vet come out, and her philosophy is survival of the fittest.
Yes.
And so at the time, we kept bringing him in the barn at night because of coyotes. And she hooked me up with livestock guardian dogs. Mm-hmm. And she's like, you don't want them in the same place in your pasture within 60 days or they're going to die. Like they're just, unless you are like worming the heck out of them, they're going to die. There's no way around it. And so I was like, she knows. She's been practicing for 40 years here. She knows our area really well. And I haven't had parasite problems yet. But, and it's been about 2.5 years.
Yeah, that's about that 60 days is about what I found as well. It's, it's all over there. And boy, there's a lot of different directions to go off of that. I know that this comes back to that whole idea of the right genetics, right? And what's interesting is a sheep, I'm gonna throw out one of my fancy words, is a holobiont, which is the fancy word for saying it's not just one species, but it's actually a consortia of species. The sheep by itself can't survive. It has to have all these bacteria and yeasts and everything in its rumen, and they all together are able to survive. If you took all of those non-sheep, living things out of the sheep would be dead because it can't literally digest anything without all. So a holobiont is technically all those different species together making one living system that can thrive, right? Mm-hmm. And so, you're thinking about that, and when you think about a sheep that way, you're like, you've got to maintain the sheep not just as a sheep, but as this like living system that when you move it from place to place, all of a sudden the microbiome of place changes, and now the way it interacts is they're eating and that food is going through the rumen. They're having to get to know all of the internal microbiology that they brought from them from the other place, and there's this moment of like rebalancing that you got to be really careful with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I did learn that lesson the hard way, like most of my lessons in life. Okay,
those are the lessons you remember.
yeah, we'll never do that again. Well, we're at an hour, which means we're gonna have to have Alan back on a different day to go into a whole different rabbit trail of I don't know. But thank you for being on today, Alan. Let's go once around the horn, starting with Shawn, then Alan, and then I'll wrap it up. Shawn, you go.
All right, yeah. Shawn with Hack My Homestead. You could find me hackmyhomestead.com or at Hack My Homestead on pretty much all the socials. I help people who want to implement some of the things that Alan talked about today more on a utility systems. I'm not the expert on growing things or livestock or anything else like that, but solar energy, designing a place that's going to work well and not be a burden on you, managing water, managing gray water and black water, things like that. That's what I help people with. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, check out the website or the YouTube or shoot me an email.
Great. Alan, what do you have for us?
Well, these days, a lot of what I'm teaching is like for design professionals on the Institute side. I run the Institute of Integrated Regenerative Design. Yeah, it's a big, long name. But that's because that side of everything is where I'm teaching engineers and architects and that sort of stuff. And we have some new professional level courses coming out, but there some serious homesteaders do come to those. That is i2rd.co. That website's being redone right now, but it's coming. That's i2rd.co. And the other thing that I will do is if we've got, especially people who are looking at larger homesteads that are very sophisticated, or even better, community level strategy, I will do some consulting on that. And I've got some of the people I've trained who actually can do all kinds of amazing stuff. If you're doing large properties, you need GIS work and site planning and hydrological repair at scale, and the stuff where we bring in civil engineers and all that kind of stuff. Or I get people who will get me consulting wise to come in and like design entire communities, how the communities lay out for in the largest community I've done for a developer was 30,000 people. So all that. And so if you're a community and you're thinking about community food security and that sort of stuff, and you need that help, then I do have a little bit of consulting time. And if you need some of the smaller scale stuff, I've got a couple folks that are amazing that can do a lot of that help for you as well. And then they can just bring me in for some of the big scale stuff if necessary. So that's kind of what I'm up to these days.
Awesome. Well, Alan will be speaking at the Self Reliance Festival. He told me a story about how he snuck into an event as an attendee trying to be incognito. They realized who he was, and he ended up doing a 2-hour roundtable discussion. He actually managed to sneak into the Self Reliance Festival without us realizing who he was for a whole time by himself. But we did figure out what was going on. This will be his second time speaking there. And the cool thing is he's not just coming to the event to speak and leave. Like he hangs out. You can talk to him and learn about, and ask, as you can tell, you can ask him anything, which is a great resource to have on site. And one of the things I love about getting together in person is we have so much community knowledge there that can just be shared. So if you have not already, grab your tickets to Self Reliance Festival at selfreliancefestival.com. If you can't come to Camden, Tennessee, October 5th and 6th, we do have digital passes. You'll see all the streams from the stage and have access to the recordings afterwards. We are not recording the roundtable discussions. Those you have to be in person to go. We have a Bitcoin breakout. I think we have a content creators roundtable in the works, and Alan's going to do a roundtable discussion in the garage about some concepts he's been playing with about structuring your world or your community in ways that offer protections from government overreach. So that'll all be happening at selfreliancefestival.com. And Alan, thanks so much for coming on. I hope to have you on again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on.